It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this session of Reviewer Meets Reviewed, which is entitled My Life as a Spy, Investigations in a Secret Police File. The author is Professor Katherine Verdery and the reviewer, Professor Michael Stewart. The format is, as usual, that we have about half an hour. The author would explain her book to us. And after that, we'll turn to a conversation between Katherine and Michael for about another half an hour, and then we'll turn to the floor for questions. So thank you very much indeed. Let's start, and therefore I welcome Professor Verdery to the floor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This is the first time I've done this, so I feel a little nervous about it. I didn't sleep very much. But I wanted to thank the RAI and especially Hanin Habik for her work in trying to set me on the true path here. So I'm going to start by mentioning that the overall topic of my research has, for the last several years, has become surveillance. And it turns out that this is a subject that gets more and more public interest as well, more books and so on. This started from my point of view with Edward Snowden's release of all these papers from the National Security Administration. I think that's where it was. And that produced a huge increment in people's awareness of surveillance in the US. Then public interest and scholarly interest looking specifically at capitalist forms of surveillance, such as in Shoshana Zuboff's well-received book, The Age of Surveillance, Capitalism. So my purpose here is to offer the rudiments of an ethnography of surveillance, but it's from the communist state of Romania to 1989. Scholars generally refer to it as socialism rather than communism. The socialist forms of surveillance were ostensibly ended when the government fell in 1989. It turned out, of course, the story was much more complicated, but I won't go into that now. After 1989, a number of things happened that had to do with trying to efface the communist period. And one of the most important for the purposes of my talk is that laws were passed. I think the final one was in 1999, promoting the action of so-called lustration, which means a purification, a listing of names of people who were seen to be associated with the secret police or members of the secret police. And people who had been followed by the secret police could apply to get their secret police file. And so I did that. And it was given to me in 2008. And it was so big that I couldn't really face it. It was 7 or 8 volumes, each one about 2 inches thick. And it was from the communist archives of the secret police. In 2008, I was given a complete Xerox of this thing. It was so big that I just put it in a box in the corner of my study and left it there while I finished the book that I've been already in the process of writing. So finally in 2014, I decided it was time to get started with this project. And as I read now much more thoroughly through the pages of the file, I found myself becoming increasingly appalled by what I was finding, especially by the extent of the surveillance. So while I became more intrigued, I also became more frightened, more just appalled, as I say. Now we have a map here of Romania looking somewhat like a large flounder facing west. And on this map, you can see, for example, if you can read it, there's a town towards the Hungarian border called Alba Iulia. It's sort of in the very middle of, in the north-south direction and to the west. There it is, great, okay. So a little bit down that river from Alba Iulia in the other direction is a village named Aurel Vlaicu, which is the one that I was working in. We'll come back to it in a moment. So in 1983, I went there for the first time to do my dissertation research. At that point, I think there was only one American scholar who had been there in an ethnographic frame of mind. And so the field was pretty much open for me. And why did I go? I was curious about communism, so-called. And I thought it couldn't possibly be that bad. So I was wanting to go and see how it really was. Romania was definitely at that time an authoritarian state, and the leader of the Communist Party was Nicolae Ceausescu, who survived for quite a long time, 1965 to 1989, when he was executed. This system of rule was maintained in power by the Soviet Union to begin with, and by the so-called Securitate, which was the secret police. The point of that organization was to prevent threats to Communist Party hegemony, especially by the US and Western Europe. In 1968, however, that underwent a change with the development of so-called détente, which I think had to do with a change in the trading interests of the various sides. But anyway, it was presented as something that it was time to become friendly with these enemies that we'd been facing off against for more than a decade. But détente, the opening of relations, was fine, except for people who were being followed by the secret police, because they now became increasingly vigilant, knowing that with greater openness, more Westerners could come in and do potentially damaging things to Romania. So let me see. By 1973, when I arrived, I was already on the radar screen from very early on. I went out to this county. I was doing a sort of reconnaissance trip on my motorbike, and I mistakenly wrote into a military zone. So a policeman stopped me, and right away a letter was written by the military commandant of that area to the secret police organizations of the county. And I was on under watch from pretty much then on. I settled in the county in a village called Aurel Vlaicu, which is the one that Hanin was just pointing to a moment ago, slightly west of Alba Iulia. I stayed for 17 months, and after that, I wrote my dissertation and went back a number of times to that village and to other places in Romania. All this time, I'm under surveillance by the secret police. I suspected that there was some activity on their part, but I had no way of, or very little way of actually knowing. And I also really had no idea how much there was until I read the 11 volumes of my file. So they think I'm looking for they think I'm looking for dissidents to make contact with them and for opponents of the regime. Am I gathering intelligence? They're asking themselves. Who are my friends? Where am I going? What am I doing in my bedroom? How am I camouflaging myself? And what's in my suitcase in my bedroom? What was in my suitcase was my field notes, and it was a suitcase with a particularly strong lock, and it took them quite a while to get into it, but eventually they did. What was it like to read this file? I looked at the file briefly when I got it and was so completely appalled that I put it away for 2 years. That reading, which I then took up again with real purpose in, what would it have been, 2014 maybe, was the most horrible experience that I have ever had, I would say. The most difficult research I've ever done, certainly. I had contradictory and varied reactions to what was happening to me. And this posed a huge challenge to ethnographic practice, which generally includes a constant effort to experience with your whole being, while at the same time standing back and analyzing those feelings and experiences. So when I did, okay, good, terrific. Can't really keep my own notes in shape here. When I was doing all of this and feeling or occasionally getting evidence of being watched, I found that after reading the file, when I went back for further visits, as I did, I was constantly looking for the secret police. It was a completely different experience, and it was completely alienating for me because the overriding logic of the file, their notes from watching me, was theirs, not mine. And so thinking of myself as being in the field, reading my own field notes, and then coming up against this alternative vision was very, very disconcerting. So I had lots of questions as I went through this thing. I read it all together about 3 or 4 times with different kinds of reactions each time. Horror and revulsion the first time through. And gradually by about the 4th reading, I was beginning to find it interesting. And so I realized that I was about ready to start my ethnography of the file. One of the questions that I was looking at in inspecting the relationship of ethnography to spying was how I am made into a spy, just even in these documents. I was constantly glancing over my shoulder if I was walking down the street to go to somebody's house. And of course, anybody following me would have assumed that that was because I was looking for pursuit, which I was. But I was definitely feeding their construct of me as a spy. Another thing was that I had often made telephone calls, both within Romania and occasionally to the US, from a phone booth that was near the hotel where I lived. And I would be constantly looking over my shoulder and wondering if anybody was close enough to hear what I was saying. And indeed, they comment in the file that I'm always going to the phone booth and looking over my shoulder. So I'm behaving like somebody who is up to no good. So I started, after that, I asked myself, how can I use this file, and especially can I meet some of these Securitate officers? And how can I use those meetings? it started with my just wanting to see them. I just wanted to see what they looked like. And then I began thinking maybe I could learn some things about the file and about them. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the question, if they thought I was a spy, why did they let me stay? They had, by the end of the middle 1980s, they had already thrown out at least 2 American anthropologists whose behavior they found unacceptable. One of them had been working on the reorganization of urban space and was finding out some rather unpleasant things about what was happening to people who were thrown out of their apartment blocks while new ones were built lacking kitchens, so that people would have to go down and have a common kitchen. And the other guy started working on the gypsies, which have always been a subject of great anxiety, revolt, and disdain on the part of the authorities in Romania. So 2 other people at least had been thrown out. Why was I allowed to stay? I did make some powerful friends at the beginning, but then I ran into some trouble with them. And so I was not as well protected as I had been at first. So I started asking myself more about this question. And my answer was taken from a famous essay by Michel Foucault, What is an Author? He proposes in brief that in 18th century Europe, the idea of the author accompanied a proliferation of writing about all kinds of things, including violent argument, accusations of plagiarism, and so on. So the problem for 18th century, the book industry and various other organizations concerned with the development of this writing for gradually for a mass audience was, how can we assign some responsibility to this proliferation of writing, which included violent argument and accusations of plagiarism and so on. So the point was to secure responsibility for any given text. And for that, you need an author, a person who comes to be seen as responsible for any given expression of meaning. Deciding who is the author of a text helps to nail meaning down when so many subjects are being discussed by so many people with so much disagreement and multiplication of possible meanings. In a word, says Foucault, an author is a principle of thrift to help reduce the proliferation of meaning. Now, I've always found this an extremely interesting argument, and for some reason, it came to me in thinking about myself as a target and other people watched as targets by the secret police. So I started by reminding myself that the Romanian communist state had been founded on the illegitimate seizure of power and persisted basically on that basis. Such a way of founding and perpetuating the new society invited resistance. And indeed, there was plenty of it at different times, more extensive than at others. So, for example, in the 1980s, when I was working there, dissident movements were becoming more common and more worrisome to the secret police. So I thought that using Foucault's argument might lead me to think that the job of the secret police was to create a few variants of the target and nail them in place to retard resistance. Now, I wasn't by variants, I don't mean particular persons, but rather a few sort of archetypes of what they would consider to be resistant, dissident figures. Some of the variants were the bourgeois capitalist, the dissident, the saboteur, the irredentist element, and the spy. So the Communist Party made up such types, and the Securitate allocated these types to people, specific people. Spy was one, and it was used as a justification for his or her expulsion. So in a word, I argue that I was a spy because of this target function, which helped to maintain Communist Party rule. And they required people like me to exercise this function. And that's one reason why many foreigners were allowed into Romania, and most of them were followed one way or another. Some of them were thrown out. And people were always wondering, well, why did they do that? I thought those people were allowed in. But that's not the point. I decided to try to meet some of my secret police officers when I realized that in my file, I could actually get their names because they signed their real names to the reports that they wrote. So I got, there were main case officers for each of the cities or areas that I worked for. So I had the case officer from the region of the county Hunedoara, where my field site was located. And there was another one in Bucharest, who's, I was there for quite a while and I was followed a lot. So he was the main guy there. And it turned out that I even had a photo of him in my file where he's meeting me to tell me not to enter the building I was about to go into to have an interview with somebody. When a friend of mine from the archive where I was reading all this stuff saw this picture, she was really appalled. She said, this is terrible. This is terrible practice. An officer is never supposed to be seen in the same frame as his target. So anyway, there it was, and I knew the guy's name and I knew his face. And in, let me see, so that was, right, two of them. And the third one was in the city of Cluj, where I spent quite a lot of time also, and could find him because I knew his name, and all I had to do was ask his name from some friends who said he was a very funny, nice guy, and he really liked folk dancing and things of that kind. So I pulled various strings to get meetings with all three of these guys, but some of my strings were pretty, how can I say, interesting. So let me say the first one, I bought a bouquet of flowers. I'd found his house, his apartment. I bought a bouquet of flowers. I rang the bell. I said, I have flowers for you. And I walked up the stairs and handed him the flowers. And he looked at me and said, you tried to get in touch with me last year, didn't you? And I said, yes. And he was looking very suspicious, but finally after a while he invited me into his apartment, and we had a talk of about 2 hours, after which I thought we had created kind of a friendly relationship. But the next time I tried to see him, and thereafter, he let me know that he didn't want to do this anymore. Why, I don't know. Now, what was I going through? So the point was, how can I use these meetings? At first, I just wanted to see them. Then I thought maybe I can learn some things. And I think I learned some things. first of all, what they were prepared to tell me they thought I was doing. What they were prepared to tell me were some of their questions and concerns. And on the whole, if I asked something they didn't want to answer, one or another of them would say, I can't talk about that. Now, I had read the secret police file of one of these guys, that is to say, his personnel file. And he said in it, he had to sign a document saying that he would never divulge the contents of his work with anybody, least of all with the target. So when they would say, well, I think I don't want to talk about that, I just let it go. But they were fascinating meetings, after which I had terrible nightmares, almost all of them. And part of the nightmare was that I got a crush on most of them just from the meeting. So aligning myself in a space with these people and asking them questions that were forbidden produced a very peculiar change in my orientation, and we can talk about that later if you want to. So these were the three officers that I got in touch with, and I read a lot of books. Some of them were memoirs of former police officers. And that was my story with the secret police. So if you have some comments that you want to make or questions about my spy function, please feel free to do so now.
Well, thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. Of course, we've all been accused of being spies doing our field work, but it's so wonderful to actually see somebody who's taken the trouble and had the possibility to flesh all that out. So we're all greatly in your debt. Thank you very much. Now we pass over to Michael Stewart from UCL, who was the reviewer of the book. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. It's amazing to see the list of people and the range of people from all around Europe and the world, old colleagues, old friends, young colleagues, young friends. So, I mean, I don't want to have too long a two-way conversation with Katherine, because I'm sure many of you have things you would like to ask. But one thing that strikes me, Katherine, about the book is that, I mean, it covers effectively the whole of your career. It covers 40 years of your life. In one way and another, but starts off, of course, with the experience which many people in the room would have had of doing field work as a young person. And then it goes on through, I should say, for people who've not read the book, 4 phases of Katherine's entanglement with the Romanian Securitate, the secret police, in the first of which she was treated as a military spy because of the location of the base that she mentioned in the talk, then was accused of being a sort of CIA gathering socio-political information, then was accused, partly because of a misinterpretation of the name Verdery, as a misinterpretation as a Hungarian name. She was accused of being a Hungarian spy in the town of Cluj with a large Hungarian minority. And finally, as a counter-revolutionary agent conspiring with dissidents. That's just over the course of 16 years in Romania. But it starts off with you as a young person, and you describe yourself as kind of not very grown up, which, I mean, I think, you know, having a look again at the book in the past few days, I was thinking, you know, that's true of all of us who did for our first field works. The Scottish British journalist Neil Acheson, who's written a lot about Eastern Europe, talked somewhere about crossing the Iron Curtain as a young person, as being a moment of rebirth for many of us. The thrill that you, in a sense, I mean, many people were not exactly stripped, but they were searched there in a way they would never have been in their previous lives at the border. And you were in this totally alien and new world. You were, in a sense, reborn. And in the book, you talk very beautifully about that, and with huge honesty about the way in which your sort of your personality was transformed by the circumstances, some partly social circumstances, the fact that in these countries, none of our friends had to work. Anyone could stop, anyone could drop out of a job, could leave at 11 o'clock in the morning and spend a few hours with an interesting Westerner. But so this moment of rebirth and well, kind of entering a liminal period, in a sense, in one's life. What I wanted to ask you, though, was kind of, because the book covers 40 years, is jumping forward, and it's something that's a tricky thing to do, but looking back now, from where we are now, and thinking of having sort of spied on yourself through this, spied on your youth through these documents, would you have done things differently, knowing what you know now? I mean, in the book you talk, well, I don't want to sort of, I'm just curious, would you, knowing what you know now about the conditions in which you carried out field work, would you have done things differently?
Okay, so you'd like me to respond to that now, not, you don't have a series that I should wait for.
No, I mean, I've got sort of 3 or 4 broad areas, just, you know, things.
Yeah, okay. Well, I actually myself, I think it would have been hard for me to do a lot of things differently with the personality that I went in with. And the lack of knowledge, because there was very little available for social scientists interested in working in the so-called communist bloc. Most of it had been written by political scientists, and they were all wedded to the totalitarian model. So although I was prepared to jettison that, it took me quite a while to come up with an alternative. And in the meantime, I was really flying by the seat of my pants. I was better at asking questions and learning things in general from the people I spoke with than I was at dealing with the suspected secret police or the apparatchiks who managed my grant and so on. But it turned out that practically everything I did, they could come up with some fairly serious complaint about. You know, so I am considering where to go and do field work after the experience with the policeman stopping me on my motorbike for riding into this military base. And I say, well, you know, where else can I go that doesn't have military bases? And it's obvious to us now that that wasn't a smart question, but that was the one that came to me. So I think I would have had to have been more grown up, and I would have had to know more about Romania before going. I would also have had to have been a better field worker, which I think I became towards the latter part of my field work, but I wasn't at the beginning. I was still, without knowing it, struggling against the totalitarian image. And I thought I knew somewhere in my bones that this was not a nice place. And the people were, you know, didn't treat each other or maybe me very nicely. And that isn't a great way to go into your field work. I liked the people that I hung out with in the village that I worked in. And mostly they seemed to be welcoming, although I found out much later that there was the constant rumor that I was a spy and that people shouldn't talk to me. And you never knew what was going to happen to you if the American came to your house, who would come after that. So they were extremely good at hiding this fact and were very hospitable and friendly and so on. But it took me a while before I learned how to ask the kinds of questions that might get their assent, usually not in the form of a question, but in the form of an observation. So I saw so-and-so going down the street the other day with his cart laden with hay, but I didn't really know what to think that was. Can you help me with this? And so they would respond to this by saying to themselves, oh, here's this university professor who doesn't know what a person with a cart of hay is. I better help. So I found that way of questioning a more successful one than my initial kind. So there's that. What else did you have here? What should I have done differently? I basically should have been more grown up right at the beginning, and that's all I can say. So I think one of the reasons that I wrote this book was as a sort of, not exactly a training book, but an expose for graduate students about to go to the field, so that they would know a little bit better what kinds of traps they could fall into. And I hope that it's having that effect now.
Well, I'm sure. I mean, one of the remarkable things you say, which struck me, was, you know, how, as a young person, we just assume that other people see us as we see ourselves. I mean, I suppose because we spent so much time with our family and our friends, and by the time you reach our minimum wage, you realise that people have very different images of us than we hold of ourselves. And I guess one's just stuck with that. As you know, that's, I mean, insofar as people's first ethnographic experience is done as a young person. But indeed, the book is a wonderful manual and provocation to people thinking about fieldwork. I want to ask you something else about sort of something slightly broader, because the book moves between the very personal and the broad. You know, Romania, a practical question is, a simple question to start with is, do you think Romania 1973-74, the level of, the feeling of oppression from the security services was radically different, lower to that, say, in 87-88? The book covers, as I said, you know, 4 different periods of your research there. Had it really changed over that time? And now that will lead on to a sort of broader question.
Yeah, it's I can say a few things about that, but it's a little hard for me to know because retrospective interviews with people are suspect what's going on in the present. And so if I said to people, did you feel repressed back then? Or some more subtle version of that, they would have said, oh, no. Now, I say they would have said, but there were always a handful of people in any location where I did some research who said, oh yeah, the secret police are after us all the time, and especially when I'd be in this party or something where people were telling jokes, and Romanian jokes about the communist period are some of the funniest things I've ever heard. So I wanted to keep track of them. And then after the joke would be told, the person who told it would look directly at me and say, I hope you're not writing this down. So I would immediately go to the bathroom and write them down. And that was, what was it that, so I was aware of that kind of response to repression. But it seemed to me that things did get and were presented as being worse and worse as the 1980s wore on. And indeed, the communist government was beginning to have tremendous economic difficulties because of the more general recession in Europe, and a lot of things that they used to sell across the border were no longer welcome, and their balance of payments were in difficulty. That was in difficulty. So there was, I think, more of a feeling that things weren't going all that well, and that the police were more likely to be listening to you.
Yes, I mean, because certainly when I first went to Romania in 1987, and I came from Hungary, which by then the János Kádár was on the way out, had already left power, and there were clear shifts. I mean, Hungary was aligned with Gorbachev, I was very struck by the level of popular fear. I mean, on my first trip to Bucharest, on my own, I was grabbed by a woman in the street. I mean, clearly I was, although I was kind of thought I was dressed like an Eastern European, she could see that I was at least from somewhere like Hungary. And she whispered to me in French, "You have to leave this city. It's dangerous for you here." And I mean, then I was crossing the road in the middle of the city, and she grabbed my hand on the and whispered this. I mean, it was positively bizarre. And you talk a bit about the fact that the Securitate was very visible. That, you know, certainly in Bucharest, there were all those young men dressed up in their blue suits. People were very aware of the Securitate. And of, I mean, the Secush, as they called them, much less, of course, of the informers, the possibility of being listened into, you talk about. And I just wonder, I mean, it's a slightly broad, sort of, you know, typical anthropological, but is there something, do you think, having spent so long working in Romania, was there some kind of elective affinity between a broad lack of trust in interfamilial, in relationships, in villages, in communities, in cities, and the ability of the security forces to instill this overwhelming sense that everyone is being listened to all the time, that we're in danger? And it's particularly striking in a way because you say somewhere in the book that the Securitate was not really that dangerous. And they did kill a few people in the course of their of the 60s and 70s, and some strikers died. And, you know, but I mean, compared to the FSB today, they were cuddly teddy bears. I'm puzzled by the sort of the way in which the state of fear was generated when actually it was, you know, there was less to fear perhaps than we all imagined.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very interesting and important question, and I sort of chewed on it in a previous book as well. But there are two things that I want to just, there's at least one thing I want to straighten out in the way you posed your question. I argue at the end of this book that the Securitate was everywhere, and people knew, you know, knew that and knew about it because they were their friends. And my landlady's brother-in-law was employed by them. And so everybody knew somebody or more than one somebody who was in their social circle, part of their network even, and who they knew was a secret police operative. So they weren't necessarily sitting around worrying, is this guy reporting on me? But they just knew that there were, with this person around, they shouldn't tell certain kinds of jokes, for instance. So it was embedded in the society in ways that I had not realized at first. I thought of this as an organization that was completely separate. And it presents itself as separate, which is part of what enables it to get good information, as they would have said. But in fact, it wasn't so separate, and people always knew some east, as they were called, that they could go to, and that's how it was very scary. So what else can I say about that? And also, I think, as I suggested at some point in the book, the most difficult place for the Securitate to really penetrate in full was the villages, because although they would have some relatives and so on there, they didn't have the kind of invisible access, let's say. So if they're hired ostensibly as a worker in a factory, there are workers all around them in the factory, and they can kind of go unnoticed. They're just another worker in that factory. But in the villages, they were all already known from the outset as somebody from the outside. And the suspicion was that anybody who came in unknown was probably a secret police person. So one of the things that went around about me at various times was I a secret police person? Was I a spy for the government, not just for the US? The upshot was, of course, a great deal of anxiety about social relationships. And one of the things that I think I finally learned in the field is something that was an old standby of anthropological work, and that is that people are formed by their social relationships, and that being embedded in social relationships is an important part of personhood. So asking myself questions about who in this community might be cooperating with the secret police, that was an option I had in the village that I didn't have in other locations. And gradually I discovered that I too was formed by my social relationships. And so the people that I knew the best were the ones ultimately that I hung out with the most, especially for just generally relaxing. And I think it hadn't completely sunk into my bones until then that this is what this anthropological truism meant.
We should open it up to the audience in a moment, because there are lots of Romanians and other people in the virtual room with us. But I just have one final question, which was, I was very struck that in this wonderful book, in the middle chapter, is a chapter called Excursus, which I think of as an excursus as a sort of a digression, a sort of a pause to reflect on things before going on with the main. But in a way, the excursus in the book is, to me, it's the core of the book, because it's the chapter where you reflect upon the experience of reading one's own file. So it puts you back at the centre. And there was something that that struck me. And it's I want to sort of explore this with you about our relationship as writers, as anthropologists, with the societies we write about. And so let me explain what I mean. But concretely,
I'm losing you, Michael. Okay, you're coming back now. Can you start again?
Sorry, I was just saying that in this central chapter, Excursus, you focus very much upon the experience of reading your own file. Yeah? And this, what I wanted to talk to you about here was our experience as anthropologists of writing about other people and their reading of our work. So as you talk about in My Life as a Spy, and as all of us who worked in Romania knew, in the introduction to the beginning of your book, Transylvanian Villagers, you put a joke, a very funny joke, about the Hungarian, the Romanian, and the German go into a pub, as it were, and everyone in the room can imagine the follow through. And it's a kind of joke that all of us in Eastern Europe have heard almost every day. Jokes like this were told. When the book came out, there was a sort of scandal in Romania, including amongst your friends, some of your friends, who were offended, shocked, and felt, because in the joke, the Romanian, the Germans mean the Hungarians impulsive and the Romanian steals to solve the problem. And you talk about the sense that you had, that you realized, you came to afterwards, that in a sense you had betrayed, the feeling you had betrayed your friends and your colleagues. In parenthesis, I would say, some of those people were also could be quite nationalistic, some of the people I heard talking in those terms. And so I felt, well, I wasn't so sure you'd betrayed them. But let me follow this through, because you say very astutely that the book you've written, it's a book about Kathy's life as a spy. It's not a book wholly about the Securitate, or what it was like for a Romanian if you were recruited. and you quote Gabriel Liceanu and others, great Romanian authors, to contrast the intensity of the horror of their experience with your own more ironic and distanced relationship with all this material. I mean, you talk about your rage and anger as well, but you're in your writing, you are cooler, as opposed to Romanian authors, for obvious reasons. But so what I was just wondering was, you're not worried about betraying their perspective on the Securitate here, and I mean, quite rightly so. But you were worried about betraying Romanian sentiment in the 1980s, when the book came out in 1983, when you went back. Is there, I mean, how do we deal? I mean, what have you got any thoughts on that relationship between the outsider who sees things as an outsider, and when they sort of dig beneath the surface in that modernist fashion that you talk about, they'll say things that are sometimes upsetting or annoying to some of the people, or frustrating. Is that something we just have to live with, or do you have any wise thoughts about what we can do about it?
Well, it's a real conundrum, because in a way you finally realize what are the things that you shouldn't have been saying as an outsider, by being an outsider first, and then gradually learning to become not exactly an insider, but in the cognoscenti. So I think part of doing field work and learning about the place that you've settled upon is precisely based in the experience that you gradually get from having messed up one way or another. And I certainly messed up. I mean, plenty of people could have told me later that those jokes were the wrong thing, but I thought that they were, I'd been there long enough to think that they were not funny, but very illustrative of Romanian nationalist stereotypes. And it took me a while longer to get into there. It was really stupid. So you have to be a field worker, a novice field worker, to gain some of the knowledge that you need to have been a better one at the beginning. If you see what I'm saying, it's a conundrum.
Yes. I've got one final, just one very small question, then we'll hand it on to David, and I can see there are questions in the Q&A, which is, I mean, I remember my supervisor saying to me before going to the field, he said, when you get really angry with them, hold on to that. I mean, don't drop it. Because the reason you're getting really angry, it's important. There's some clash between your presupposition, your expectations, and their expectations. And indeed, I mean, the first paper I ever wrote was about me getting really angry about people shouting all the time, purely by chance. But was there, I mean, you're quite self-effacing in some ways in this book. Were there times when you were doing your field work when you got really mad with people? And do you mind sharing? You don't want to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would always get really mad if I had reason to think that somebody who had been presenting him or herself as friendly was an informer for the secret police. Then I would feel this sense of betrayal and so on. But that wasn't, that's obvious. Another one that's also obvious, but maybe not experienced by so many people, is having done my first field work for a year and a half in this one community, I went back for another field stint, and this time I stayed in the Romania is governed through communes, and each commune has between 5 and 12 villages. So my village, Aurăvlaicu, was part of the commune of Georgiu, And when I started trying to do some work in Georgiou, especially as time went on, I would have the experience of making an appointment with somebody. I'd say, I'll come by around 2, or, what time is good for you tomorrow? And I'd go there and they wouldn't be there. This didn't happen to me so much in my first place. If people made an appointment with me, they stayed for it. But it happened fairly often in Georgiou, and it got me very riled up and angry. And so I had to ask myself, basically the self-reflective question: why am I so angry? What did I expect out of this? Was that a reasonable expectation? And so on. So does that conform to your experience also?
Yes, no, very, yeah, indeed, very much so. But I mean, perhaps it's not so trivial. I mean, because you said that your first comment, because your most recent book is indeed a product of that anger that you felt when you realized you'd been betrayed by people who were pretending to be friends and actually had very different motives. So no, I think anger is well, it's what you say in the book. We use our whole bodies when we're doing ethnography, and that's exactly what you've done with this work, remarkably. I'd like to hand it to David, because I know I think I said that I would stay visible for this section, just so that
absolutely. No, the conversation now becomes a generalized one, but your input is, of course, is very, very welcome, Michael. Thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating conversation. We've got lots and lots of questions, but why don't we begin with Richard Verdery? Good afternoon, Richard. Nice to see you. And Richard would like to ask you, did your reading of the files make you rethink your relationships with specific villages or your closest informants? Well, we've lost you for a moment then. Perhaps I should repeat the question.
Catherine's, I think her internet.
Yes, I can't hear.
Okay. Richard Verdery would like to ask whether your reading of the files changed your relationship with your previous informants.
I cannot hear the question. It's funny. We're having a little trouble here. The connection is cut off for me, but it might come back.
Well, why don't there's a question for Michael, actually, from lower down, from something that he said. If we let Michael answer that one, maybe your internet will come back. Michael, there's a question which says that you seem to imply that the security forces were not very dangerous. But there's somebody in the chat says, in fact, they were pretty bad. They would torture you or psychologically damage you if you got on the wrong side of them. And he would just ask you to clarify that.
So yes, who's the question from? Sorry, I
don't remember the name, but who asked it?
No.
Yes, it's an anonymous attendee.
Right. I mean, I don't want to, trivialize people's experience. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in 1988 and 89 talking to people who had fled Romania, and many of whom had had pretty horrible time with the Securitate. Compared to the Stasi, and compared to the KGB, I think we can say the Romanian Securitate was relatively either less effective or less willing to use the mode of outright terror. What I was struck by, and what Katherine and I was talking about, was whether the level of fear of the Securitate was greater, whether the effectiveness of the Securitate was linked to their very visibility, and whether their effectiveness was greater in terms of their perception they created of being all present and all around us than the reality of large-scale gulags, prison camps, and the like, which is not to in any way diminish the physical suffering of many people. And of course, I mean, if one talks about the 50s and 60s, one's talking about, I mean, again, it's very different, and people being killed.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I'm sure that helps clarify it very well. Katherine, in the hope that you can hear us again now,
Yes.
Richard verbally would just like to ask, after you read the files, did that then change your relationship with your village and villagers that you had spoken with previously during the course of your fieldwork?
It changed the relationship for me with people who had signed informers' reports. And one of the many things in the excursus that Michael mentioned was that I found myself responding very negatively to the informers until I finally began getting a fix on what their situation had been. So it did change my relationship with some of them, but for the most part, I would come up with excuses for why they did what they did if they were my good friends. That just shows you that you are the sum of your social relations. So I don't know if there's something you want to follow up with that, but
I think if Richard would like to write a further comment, of course, we'd be delighted to hear from him. But I think that's a nice answer.
I mean,
Michael, please.
Yeah, for people, Katherine, who've not read the book, the book is beautifully presented and structured because there's different materials in it. There are field notes, there are informers' reports, and so on and so on. But throughout the book, you don't unmask the people who reported on you, who've not spoken, who've not kind of said to you, I was an informer. You use their what the Securitate called their conspiratorial names, Anna or Grosjean or whatever, but in inverted commas, yeah. And later, and you say that one woman who had said to you that, who had confessed to you before 1989, look, Kathy, I had to do this. You don't use those sorts of scare quotes, yeah. And again, it's very restrained of you. One feels that the scare quotes here, they could be daggers.
Well, it was, in part, the real challenge for writing this book was, first of all, to try to present as openly as I could my field methods and dilemmas and so on, but also to honor the social relationships in which I had become embedded, revealing those to the friends and associates of the people that I talked with. And at the time that I was, that's not true. I was going to say something stupid. So I felt that especially one story is about a friend of mine who discovered that she had gay inclinations by being with me. And that wasn't a thing that was particularly, and it still isn't, there's particularly welcome in Romania by the population. So I didn't really want to out her to her friends. So what was there to do but use a pseudonym or create an image that took some of her characteristics and give them a different sign. But it was a difficult decision to make because obviously if people, if this was, they would read it in a very different way. For an American reader, it didn't really make that much of a difference. And so since I figured that was my principal audience, I would just proceed in that way.
David, I think Jennifer Cerns has a question really on this, because Kathy talks about being, in the book, about being like the stray dog who goes into the village, and the Securitate come in with her like fleas in her hair. I mean, the way, or again, she uses this wonderful image of being radioactive, that, you know, that she becomes aware that people she's come into contact with have been trapped because a Westerner has come, and now they can be used by, they could never have been touched before by the Securitate, but because of the presence of an anthropologist, they now can. And Jennifer's question touches directly on this, I saw.
Indeed, indeed. Would you like to read it out, or Michael, or shall I?
Oh, right. I thought they were, well, okay, Jennifer says, when conducting fieldwork in Cuba, I've often worried about drawing unwanted attention from the state towards my Cuban friends, research participants, while going about my own work. Did you ever have to change your research plans in Romania to protect those around you?
That's a tricky question. I don't think I did at the beginning, because I wasn't as aware as I became later that I was embedded in a whole surveillance operation that implicated a lot of other people. But I always, from fairly early on, adopted certain covering behaviors that I suspect actually made me more suspicious. But for example, if I went on a ride on the train from my community back to Bucharest to consult with my research supervisor, sometimes I would sit there and read a book, and sometimes it was in English, in which case I was likely to be getting questions from people about who I really was, you know, was I an American or an English person. And sometimes it would be a Romanian newspaper or something, which made it a little less clear to them what I might be. And occasionally, if I were reading something in Romanian, people would start asking me, so who are you and where are you from? And I would just pretend that I was a Romanian and see what happened. And so I think that I don't know whether that drew unwanted attention, because most of those people were fleeting encounters. But I remember one very long train ride in which the guy who was a worker in a factory somewhere along this route, and he would ask me all kinds of questions, and I would give answers that would have been appropriate for a person from the village that I'd come from. And finally he looked at me and he said, "But who are you really?" So he'd gotten something from my accent. My accent in Romanian was was relatively unnoticeable. It was I had a pretty good Romanian by that time. Who are you really? And so then it became interesting to talk about, you know, what is really. But mostly, I think. I'm sorry, what was the thrust of the beginning of your question?
Did you have to change? Did you ever drop a track in your research because you thought this is actually going to get people, you know, my informants are going to be in trouble with, you know, or it's going to lead to complications for them?
Yeah, I tended to be fairly unsubtle in this. If it were a person that I had reason to think was probably going to be getting into some trouble from this, I would say to them somewhere early in the conversation, you know, you may not wish to have this conversation because I'm not, you know, the most neutral person for you to be becoming friends with. But that's part of when I say I was relatively unsophisticated at the time, and I couldn't, you know, I've always had this kind of open and frank way of meeting with people. So I was trying to be open and frank, which was really not a very successful strategy for me there. But people sometimes responded well to it and thanked me for giving them the thumbs up.
Yes, that's fascinating as well. But someone else would like to ask, who doesn't give the name either. Do you think there may have been a functional reason that they didn't throw you out? I mean, was it useful for them to have a few foreigners wandering around, perhaps?
Yes, I think it was. I was giving a different kind of interpretation, but of course it was also useful for them because to the extent they could follow my activities and find somebody else who was implicated with me, they might be able to get someone new into their network. So, for example, I had an intimate relationship with a guy who was, at that time, he was a couple of years younger than I was, so he was just finishing high school. And it was clear that later on that the hotel that we were thinking was safe was, of course, not safe. It was mined with microphones. And it just seemed to me that it was important for the people to, the Secu, to know whom they could trust among their own people. So there was that kind of functional reasoning. It wasn't just that they needed some foreigner or some external impulse to get to help them get more information about the locals. So it was complicated, I think. I just liked the Foucauldian explanation better because it seemed to me more interesting and more unexpected when I started thinking about it. So I figured most people would think of the functional reasons. They wanted to catch the person who might be the spy. But I wanted to produce this somewhat more quirky argument.
Oh, indeed, I can see that it's a wonderfully complex situation. Well, let's try and bring in somebody voice-wise. We've just got one person who would like to do that. And if it doesn't work, many apologies, but let's try. So Soraya Tremaine from Oxford would like to ask a question. So Soraya, if you're there, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Soraya. Yes. Go ahead. How nice to hear you.
Yes, and nice to see you, David. Professor Verdery, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I am from Oxford. I'm at Oxford University and an anthropologist myself. I spent 3 years in Romania from 1975 to 1978, probably about the same years that you were going on and off doing your research, but in a completely different position, different capacity from you, because my husband was posted. He was working for the Shell company, and he was posted as the Shell representative there. So I wasn't going in as an anthropologist doing a study of my own, but I was under double scrutiny, not only by the Romanian Securitate, but also by the Shell company, because before going to Romania, they were warning, we had full briefings. We were completely aware where we were going and how the Romanian intelligence services worked, and we would be under constant supervision. So we went with completely open eyes about where we were going to, but I was also given very stern warning by the Shell company that I must not act in a way as an anthropologist to jeopardize the company's position in a socialist country. So I had to censor myself as well at that time. And obviously your fascinating talk, I can go on talking to you for months about my 3 years of experience, but I'm not going to do that. The couple of things I wanted to say is the level of awareness of the local, of how they were under supervision or not, in my experience, depended very much on who you were in society. For example, people who were working with us in our house to help us, they were not really very aware of what they were also under supervision, whereas we knew everything they said to us and we said to them would be heard and supervised. We had to tell our Romanian helpers not to talk in the house, but the telephone would ring and that would stop their listening device. I would either write down what I wanted to say or I would take them out in the garden and talk to them. So that was one thing. And also those Romanians who were aware that the Securitate was spying on them, work at different levels and different capacities. So knowing that I had no room for maneuver, either from the shell company or from Romanians themselves, I had to find ways of communicating with Romanians. We used to live in a small village called Snagov, which was 20 miles north of Bucharest, in a village which was the summer residence of Ceausescu and of all the ruling party. They only came in the summer to those villas. And so we were in contact with the administration, and I started befriending the administration, who were all obviously people who were working for the government, and they had one particular agent who was constantly reporting on everything we did. But I became friends with them, and by that time you can see a different side of them. It's not all about lying or bribing, which is of course there, as we all know about that sort of situation. But they also had become friends. They would come out and sit in the garden and talk, and you could see that side of them. And I remember when we were there, serious earthquake happened, and one of the same security man, who was never allowed to come to our house and take a cup of coffee or anything, came first thing in the morning shaking, saying, "Give me a glass of whiskey. I'm beginning to believe there is God after all." And they also had learned how to get around the system themselves. And people who had to bribe the security people who called on them, or the farmers, for example, they didn't do that for favor. They did that to stop them from doing them harm. So the levels of relationship were very, very different. And I won't go on taking up everybody's time, but just one last example. The woman who used to help us in the house, her daughter used to come home and say, "Mother, I'm not allowed to go to church with you because our teacher says God doesn't exist and we mustn't go to church." And the mother said, "Okay, fine, I'll take you to the next village because your teacher can't see you." And when they went to the next village, they found the teacher herself was in the church in the next village. So, they all had learned how to get around the system, basically. I have got many, many experiences which I can't share with you because there is no time. But I just wanted to thank you very much for, actually giving. I would hate to go back and ask the Romanians to give us our files. Probably we'll need lorryfuls of reports. And the last thing is, my husband's assistant, who was a Romanian, wanted to defect. And when he defected, we said to him, "Well, why did you defect?" He said to my husband, "Look, I was sick and tired of having to spy on you every day. That's why I ran away." Completely different insight and position from yours, but absolutely everything you say rings bells. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Would you like to comment on that, Katherine? You're most welcome if you would.
Those are great observations. It partly puts me in mind of a very common Romanian expression, and it's common among Americans who've worked in that country as well. And it's something like, no matter how suspicious you become, it's never enough. But I think that it was interesting that your company was so willing to put restrictions on what you were allowed to do. I don't think I've ever heard that before. It makes perfect sense and it depends a little bit on when you were there, but the Romanians were certainly big at spying on enterprises so that they could get trade secrets. That was another thing that was suspected in their interest in the exchange program. So we have an exchange program between Romania and the US, and 10 Americans come and they want to do stuff on Romanian history and Romanian literature and the occasional village researcher. But the Romanians coming to the US would all go to Texas Instruments. So it was clear that they had other kinds of things they wanted to learn. Someday, if I ever get to travel again to England, it would be really great to have a conversation with you. So please send me an email with your address.
Well, thank you very much. There's a very nice question here from Elizabeth Dunn. Really, a lot of the questions are wanting to ask your advice. And so Elizabeth would like to ask you, well, I'll read out a question. He says many countries in Eastern Europe have turned back toward authoritarianism. And if you're advising a graduate student now, how would you advise them to think about the potential for them having a file of their own being written on them? How do you think this should affect their research? And are there new dangers of surveillance, now digital ones, but were not present, of course, when you were doing your research? So indeed, what do we say to our students just starting their careers about all this?
Yep, that's a very important question. Fortunately, I've retired, so I don't have to answer it. But Elizabeth does, because she's teaching about Eastern Europe and having graduate students and doing so very well. The return to authoritarianism certainly is evident in the countries the country that she's had the most contact with, Poland, and also it's really bad in Hungary. So far, it's not quite so bad in Romania, so I haven't thought about that as much as I might have. But I think that the question really is, what would the authoritarians be interested in finding? Is a foreigner going to be useful as a spy for them in the way that a foreigner might be to the secret police? So I haven't really thought through this question, but it does seem to me that it has to be discussed with students before they go. Let me just see, what did I see? Can't read my own writing. I think it would be helpful if a professor gave something like my book to students to read, certainly. So that, but then you'd have to have a conversation about what were the kinds of things that the government back then was interested in that this one might not be, and vice versa. So where are the areas of the points of greatest anxiety on the part of officials, let me see, I can't quite think of an example, but I think it's a very, very important question, and I'm glad you presented it to the audience, even if I didn't give it a very successful answer.
Yes, of course, there's also, please, Michael, please, go ahead.
Nice question from Viorel Anastasoi, who asks you, I mean, he says how much he appreciated the writing of this book. But he says, is this book a sort of, and he contrasts it with your more political economy influenced earlier work. He says, is this book a sort of coming to terms with the writing culture challenges to anthropological writing for you?
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, let's see, how many people are in this audience who will completely change their impression of me, according to my answer. I think that I have to admit that there was certainly some of that in my thinking about this material that I had. And that is that I think I did a political economy of the Securitate in part in this book too, and of the researcher in the environment of the Securitate. But I think that I was also concerned to suggest, one of the criticisms I always had of the writing culture people was that too often it seemed as if there was nothing except the situation they were in. So there wasn't any grounding in what kinds of political issues there were, what were economic difficulties that were being addressed, and things of that kind. And I wanted to make it clear that being in a particular kind of field situation made all the difference. And therefore, much of the writing culture work was just leaving out some of the most important things. So that's a very loose answer, but he's right that I had to pay attention.
He also asks, I mean, just briefly, whether if you'd been given the files in 1990, 1991, you know, if Romania had gone the East German route, you know, and found its own Gauk and so on, and opened up, you know, Would that have changed the course of your research in the next 20 years? I mean, you know, would you have changed your research questions projects afterwards in Romania? Would it have given you an opportunity to do something if things had opened up 10 years earlier, I suppose?
It sounded that.
Did you hear that, Katherine? Sorry.
If things had opened up when I was still going there to do research, is that part of the question was silent.
Sorry, if Romania had
I couldn't
opened
hear
files,
part of it, so
if Romania,
and I still can't hear it.
can you hear now, Katherine?
Now, yes, keep going.
If Romania had given you the files in 1990,
Nope, it's gone. I'll do this if I can't hear.
You might try switching off your video, Katherine, just in case we get a bit more bandwidth.
I might move to Elżbieta's question because it's shorter. Katherine, can you hear?
Yes, I can right now.
Good.
Oh, well, just quick, simply, if Romania had given you the files, opened up the files right at the transition, as East Germany did more or less, would that have changed your research projects in Romania in the following 20 years? Would you have done something different? Would you have not done collectivization, or how would it have changed what you did if you had access to that material right at the beginning of the transition?
So if I would have gotten my files, read them, and then continued to go to Romania. That's the idea. Well, I think I would have had a period of not wanting to go back to Romania, so that has to be factored in. But it was the subjects that I picked, like collectivization, they were just too interesting to leave aside. So I might still have done that, even having read the files. And people, at the time I was doing the research on that book, I would go to visit people and ask them how they'd gotten their land back and what they were doing with it and so on. And a few of them would say to me at the end of the conversation, you know, this was a lot more fun and interesting than what you used to do. So there was that I got inspiration from what was happening, not from the fact that the files had been released. But would I have backed off? Would I have said, okay, if I'm going to have files all the time, I don't want to do this? That's possible, because it was really terrible shock to read the files.
Elżbieta Dratkiewicz has a question that directly follows from that, which she says, you mentioned that your primary book audience was in the USA. Would you write this book differently if the primary reader was Romanian? What would you write differently if you were rewriting it for a Romanian audience?
Well, it did come out in translation almost the same time as the American version, but I think but it was coming out as a translation, not as a new work. And I think I would have left aside some of the things about sexual activity and so on, which was aimed specifically at American researchers, particularly graduate students like me. And otherwise, I'm not sure I would have done it that much differently, except I would have been more careful about people getting caught up in my movements. So I would have been watching myself much more intently. Well, how about you? What do you think about that?
Have we lost Katherine?
not having a good time. Okay.
Catherine, can you hear again?
How about I switch Catherine's video off myself?
You
and
keep
we're
going
gonna
in and
see-
out.
Catherine, I'm going to switch your video off and we'll see if that makes the connection better for you with the sound, okay?
Okay. So go ahead, Michael, let's try it again.
No, we have a question much earlier on. I hope that Una Kim is still in the room with us, because I meant to come to it earlier. It says, she thanks you very much for the presentation. Two questions. One, to what extent do you think works in anthropology are overlaid with practices of spies? And I think, I'm sorry, Una, I think you probably mean, to what extent is anthropology at research and surveillance by an anthropologist like research and surveillance carried out by spies? We'll take the questions one by one. That's her first question.
So are anthropologists spies? Spy-like?
Really spy-like, as she's asking, yeah.
Spy-like, yeah. Well, there was a famous article written by Franz Boas back in 1919, I think it was, Anthropologists as Spies, in which basically he was saying, don't you even think of it. But for, if somebody were going to start doing things now, I think I have a section in which I discussed that in the book. To what extent is being an anthropologist like being a spy? It's certainly involved trying to find out things by things of that kind, but it's certainly in its will all kept under lock and key. So I'd say you have to look closely at the situation, but it's possible that you could be looking like a spy, even if you don't think you are.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yes. I mean, I think in the book you quite
now I can't hear Michael. Wait.
I was just saying, can you hear me now, Catherine? I mean,
yes.
Okay, I was just saying that in the book, you do have an important discussion, I think, about the nature of deceit and the experience of abjection that living in a dictatorship of that sort generates. And I think that's very different. I mean, although, of course, anyone who's carrying out research uses similar techniques, the relationship between a spy and the people they're observing, I suspect, is very different than that of most, I hope, all. I mean, we know that some anthropologists have behaved, and we know that some people have been spies, but the vast majority of our colleagues we trust have not. But I mean, the social relationships as a result resulting from that work is very, very different.
Yes. I think that some of the most interesting stuff along these lines comes from David Price's books, recent books, where he spells out chapter and verse people who are engaged in one or another kind of spying and what sorts of effects it had on at least some of them. So it's a very legitimate and important question. And it was also one of my motivations for writing this book, to at least raise the question, is your research a form of spying? But the question about abjection, I'm not remembering right now what I argued there. So if you could just give me a hint in a couple of words.
Well, it was really, you cite Czesław Miłosz saying that, Westerners misunderstand the nature of repression in these sorts of societies. You know, the state isn't this great monolith. It creates this kind of feeling of being abject. It worms its way into intimate relations. I mean, and you know, many people in the room will have read the accounts in which, you know, somebody's spouse is being blackmailed into informing upon the other spouse. I mean, that sort of thing. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think I didn't read Miłosz until a good bit later, but I think that the point he's making is extremely important. And I was interested in my work from fairly early on to raise questions about the totalitarian vision, analytic vision, and more general vision in the US of communist systems. So, but the idea of abjection as being important to drawing people into informing, I think has definitely got something to it, that what he's saying is, forget this huge image of this giant, you know, machine that is oppressing people. What you have to look for is what the people down in on the ground, as we say, are doing and thinking about it, and how they're drawn into the informer relationship, because that's one of the most interesting and complicated features of this that way of life. There's the few people that I could talk to about how they were drawn into the informing relationship. Sometimes it was about being terrified, indeed, so abjection. But sometimes it was about wanting to get more favors from the secret police. So turn your secret police officer into a source of gifts and other such things. And that happened often enough. So it's more complicated than abjection.
One of the things, which we haven't really touched on, it was this, it's, you know, you say it's kind of, well, to me, it was absolutely fascinating that when you first went to Romania, your original project was to find the kind of elementary unit of cultural homogeneity. Which of course, those of us who brought up in the sort of debates about social structure and structural functionalism of the 1970s and 80s will find very familiar. And of course, Durkheim. And it goes on being an incredibly important issue in anthropology. And in a funny, I was thinking in a funny way, you found it. The Securitate was a sort of minimal structure of cultural homogeneity. To which you as a foreigner were an enemy, a likely enemy. And you talk about the fact that in the book, that one of the goals of the Securitate would be, you think, would be to have isolated you, to have separated you from Romanians, because they would want to stop this enemy disrupting, doing damage. And yet, the whole book is a testimony to their complete failure. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier on when I was talking about the relative weakness of the Securitate. And if you think, so if we think, I don't know how many people here have read Carrie Humphrey's Karl Marx Collective, but the access Carrie had, admittedly in the 1960s, to Buryatia was greatly restricted compared to that which you and your colleagues had in the 70s. It's just it's just a comment really to the effect that they really failed to isolate you. So that you use Hocking at times and say, look, you were made up as a spy, yeah. But in Hocking, my sense is that people are made up into statuses which they then institutionally genuinely live in all kinds of ways. And you weren't. Your friends in Romania, you weren't a spy. the Securitate failed. Is that, and that's a sign of, in a sense, I would provocatively say, once again, of their relative weakness.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, it's just a...
Yeah. Well, that's a more subtle way of seeing it than just making up people, which sounds sounds sexy. So I think I would want to take your line if I were being serious about this and say they were making up statuses, and the question then would be, to what extent did people live those?
Yeah.
And what kinds of people lived them and what kinds did not?
Exactly. I mean, in a funny way, I suspect that modern Western security systems are much better at making up people into dangerous citizens, potential terrorists, etc., than the Securitate were at making up people. But I mean, that's perhaps a very broad topic to raise here.
Comparison between the surveillance in Western systems and the East European ones is vast. Too big for this moment, but it's a fascinating one.
Yes. So my sense is that we have, I mean, can you see other questions that we should?
Yes, I think we've gone through a lot of them. I mean, I'm very, very interested by the point that you made that the logic is different when they write about the ethnographer. And that made me think that you know, when we write ethnographies about other peoples, it's not so much that what we write down is wrong, but certainly we don't write with the same logic as they do. And I kind of almost see a comparison with when we write about societies and when they were writing about you, because both of them are kind of based on reality, but on the other hand, the people we're writing about would never think about writing about themselves in that way. I don't know if the comparison has struck you at all, Katherine.
Well, I do have a section someplace in this book in which I try to make a bit of a comparison between the Securitate as ethnographers and the ethnographer that we know. But we each have our logic of thinking that we're getting at a truth. And the question is, where is that truth, the elements of that truth situated in the life of the person doing the interrogation? And in the case of the Securitate, they are fixed on these particular kinds of images that I mentioned earlier, the spy, the bourgeois, exploiter, things of that kind. So they're kind of looking for pieces of evidence to confirm one or another of these stereotypes. And I hope that the good anthropologist is doing it differently, certainly not trying to fit people into already conceptualized categories. Now, maybe that wasn't true so long ago, but at least we've had plenty of criticism of that as a procedure.
Sure. I mean, that's exactly what Margaret Mead was, of course, criticized for doing, rightly or wrongly. That was the basis of the criticism about her work, wasn't it?
She was making up people.
Yeah, and she was pushing her own, that Bowers was forcing her to look into this, which she simply imposed upon the people, and the people were quite friendly and went along with it. That's the criticism, of course. So I have no idea how much of the reality. But going back to your work, Rachel Tuff would like to ask a question. Really, your advice. She says that she's trying to work in a state-run museum in Vietnam, and she's just got to Saigon, and she's stuck in quarantine. So, well, thank you for joining us from your quarantine, Rachel. I hope it helps pass it. But she says that she has a stumbling block in terms of access to her field site. And do you have any experience or advice about securing access in socialist spaces when the gatekeepers are proving difficult?
I was lucky in that respect because my research supervisor there had some ideas about where he thought I might thrive. Now, I'm sure there were plenty of other places I could have gone that would have been equally interesting. But this one, he was used to doing research in villages with something like participant observation. So he took me to the field and on the train, and he set up a meeting with several people from the village and started asking them questions as if to illustrate to me how that was done. So I never had the problem of picking a field site. I just, I had a small area in which I could pick a settlement, but otherwise that wasn't the question. I was prevented from picking other sites.
That's a pity. It was such an interesting comment. Perhaps it'll come back in a few seconds, Michael.
We lost Katherine.
We lost Katherine completely. Let's just wait for a second.
Military purpose, I could go to the West.
We lost you there for a little bit, Katherine.
Can't hear you.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
We just missed the last bit of your advice about, as I understand it, it's basically make as many local friends as you can in any way you can, just to get some way to interact better with the society. Do I understand that correctly? A little bit broke up, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's certainly where I was heading. I think it's any place in the world is interesting. You just have to find out what's interesting about it, and then in a certain way, it doesn't matter where you settle. This was the advice one of my professors at Stanford gave for finding your country that you were going to go and work in. Find a country you're interested in. You like to sail, go to the South Seas. You like snow, go to the North of the American Indians. So I think that's good advice. If you have too narrowly honed a research proposal, that's probably not going to stand you in good stead, because if you run into problems of access, and especially this researcher you're talking about will have worse ones now than a person working in Eastern Europe, then you'll find interesting things, and you'll be pushed in the direction of interesting things that you didn't think were interesting at first. So the idea is to keep your mind as open as possible.
Katherine?
I know the other thing that Romanians would say is that you just have to find the right person that you have to curry favor with. And that's, I'm sure, just as true in Vietnam as it was in Romania. The person you have to take packs of cigarettes to, things of that kind of thing, that sort of thing.
Katherine, there's just one final little very nice question from Michael Hertzfeld, who says, if there's still a moment, my advisor, John Campbell, of the Sarakatsani, of course, who were notoriously secretive, once said that all anthropologists are cultural spies in quotes. Do you see any relationship between real spying and learning cultural secrets? In other words, acquiring cultural intimacy? That puts it quite, I think.
Just a brief answer, Katherine, because we're out of time now, but have the last word, please. Just what do you think? Is there a similarity?
Well, I think the answer must be yes, but you have to fight against that. So
an excellent answer. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to our author, Michael. Thank you so much for your expert and wonderful comments as reviewer. And all we can say is, well, thank you for joining us and making this this rather overcast afternoon so much brighter. And thank you to everybody wherever you are in the world.
Okay.
Thank you, the participants.
Thank you all for your questions. It was lovely to be there, but I wish I could have seen more of you. Okay. Thank you for your welcome too, David.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Michael. Thank you
Okay,
to the audience.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day now.